within 48 hours, you're going to have a dream.
Welcome to the Blue Door Playbook, a podcast for the soul, featuring the work and wisdom of archetypal psychotherapist Timothy Tate. I'm your host, Putter Brown. Episode 10, Our Shadow.
Hi, Putter.
Hi, Timothy. Here we go. 10 years ago, you did a lecture at the Lindley Center.
Oh, my.
Wonderful, wonderful building in our town.
Yes.
With so much history for you personally.
Yes.
And the community.
No doubt.
And you gave the title to that lecture, Living with Our Shadow. Tell me a little about how you came to that and chose that as the title.
You know, the underworld or the unconscious or the hidden parts of our psyche that we don't let ourselves know about, our own kind of defense mechanisms, but it's not that Freudian. It's more subtle than that. It's this idea of the shadow or living with our shadow is how do we have a relationship with the almost alternative or alter ego that carries the burden of what the conscious ego, or at least the awake ego, banishes, doesn't want to deal with.
One of the first words you used to kind of describe that lecture was find it.
Mm-hmm.
And so where do you start that process?
Right. Whatever makes you uncomfortable, that's a start. Whether it's how you appear or how you look or how you age or how you, in your own way, evaluate yourself. So it's a story about how we have the courage to face what we otherwise banish. And so living with our shadow is a way of integrating content that we otherwise have banished. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm fascinated by shadows, period. Mm-hmm. I have hundreds of photos of shadows, of people, myself on a hike, just that whole shadow on the ground or on the trail or on the pavement in front of me that I'm connected to, but there's light behind me, so it projects my shadow on some surface, and I'm fascinated by that. So how we find it or what some cues are or clues are is that sense of curiosity and exploration and courage to even know that you have a shadow. But that finding the shadow and resources about that I'll get to in a second is a rather mature move and can happen typically only when something has come along in your life that has disturbed you, that you, quote, didn't see coming.
Mm-hmm. And when you first hear that you have a shadow, or you first start to feel it, realize it's possible.
Yes.
That sounds like very scary.
Yes.
How could you say, I have a shadow?
Mm-hmm.
Or what are we really talking about here? Because I'm fine.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the core work of my private practice is to introduce this idea and then start to help the individual talk about or research or read about this mystical idea of our shadow, So I'll assign the book Romancing the Shadow by Connie Zweig. That's the primer for this approach, is study this, and then, as we do in the practice, underline a journal about it, bring that content and see if we can't go on a exploration together to realize, to find, to understand the depths of your shadow, which is no small task and never complete, never done job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you say find it, you're going on a tough mission.
Yes.
It's not one book and done, or one dream and done, or...
No. It's the opportunity for the individual I'm serving at that moment to face themselves and have an encounter with their shadow side that liberates such content that it can be overwhelming, because you have to often break through the shame story, the shadow and shame. You have to first realize that your sense of inadequacy is in play here, and it's the robust fuel behind what we're suggesting might be your shadow. And without learning about that, in my mind, how is the individual going to find a way to face themselves without it being then the shadow projection onto everyone else, particularly loved ones? If we don't face our shadow, we project it on those we love. And then it gets really difficult or complex. But if you have language for it and if you have tools for it, then you have a fighting chance.
Mm-hmm. And the book that you mentioned, Romancing the Shadow, when someone takes that on, studies it, comes back to you with some sense that I do have a shadow, that's a huge breakthrough from, let's say, when I first came to your office and I don't think that I could have a shadow,
right, because
I'm just fine, or how could I have a dark side? So when I cross over that and I come to you and I've studied Romancing the Shadow, the book, then what are some next steps?
Well, you're going to have nightmares when you take on the shadow deliberately, intentionally. In my own kind of worldview, I guess you could say, the shadow wants attention as well. It's not hiding and enjoying itself, hiding. It's simply where we have cast all that we cannot abide, or because of the shame piece that we were just talking about, or otherwise manage. We banish it to the shadowlands. And so to invite a conversation with the shadow, and that reading the book, it will usually generate some dark dreams. Dreams kind of with the theme of a stranger in the dark hallway, some kind of motif where there's a darkness of the scene. Literally, the scene is dark. It's not well lit. And so the dreams start helping us with the content that has been banished. Some might say into the unconscious. We're talking about it being banished into the shadowlands of our psyche, where everything that we're afraid of, don't want to face, and are ashamed of hangs out. Part of, for instance, my shadow is arrogance. I've been blessed with a certain level of intelligence, and I don't have a lot of patience, even though that's what I do for my practice, which is kind of its own irony. But the intensity of the shadow work and the darkness it brings is a call to individuals, including myself. That's who I was referring to in a minute ago, owning my own shadow, to get one more level of real. Not have that arrogance and intelligence carry the day, the judgments that come with that. But in that cluster of behaviors and attitudes, superior would be another word for it. Then you're really showing your inferior function, your weaknesses, and that's who's going to go, hey, let's talk about my inadequacies and weaknesses. Mm-hmm. That's not usually on the menu.
No. What I heard you owning and speaking about was you did the work to find it.
Mm-hmm.
And next steps after that big body of work to find it, you said, was to contain it.
Mm-hmm. So how do we do that?
Yeah, how do we do that? Oh.
Yeah. Well, I think the container idea is the notion that we can grasp something. We can put our psychological arms around it. And containment is a form of taking responsibility for your shadow. That's kind of the intention of what that means, or the definition of what that means. Taking responsibility for what you're otherwise avoiding is containing it. You have some sort of awareness about it now, and you have a responsibility then to manage it / contain it. I just went to in my own mind, the bucking horse sale in Miles City, and watching cowboys as they get on this contained wild horse. And at some point, that gate's going to be open. And the fury and intensity of that ride is on. So that might be a graphic example of what it means to try to contain your shadow. It doesn't go, okay, you're right. I'll kind of just amble through the courtyard. No, it puts up a fight.
With the force of a bucking bronco.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it can drive you crazy.
Yeah.
What can drive you crazy is not paying attention to it. As you start to turn that page, as we're talking about, and look to face it, to identify it, to contain it, to have a relationship with it, then as anything that's been discarded, anything that's kind of homeless, when you pay attention to it and invite it to the table, it doesn't say, oh, no. It's like curious, bashful, but a relationship evolves. There's a beginning of a different type of relationship with your depth once you admit and look at and maybe start to contain the shadow.
The work to contain it, what kind of practices help?
Well, that's the toolkit in my practice, as we have talked about, applies here as well. The dreaming, the journaling, the writing, the reading, and the honesty to speak about these things with your loved one. That's probably where it gets most intense, is once you start to face or contain or address your shadow. Then if you're in a relationship with an intimate other, those are the hardest conversations to have. Those are the ones that go, oh no, I think I got to go. I think something's going to happen here that I don't want to face. And that's the richest part of what intimate relationships are for, is to have the container that's healthy enough to have these difficult conversations. I think what I'm saying is that the journey, once you find out that you can take this journey, however that comes, again, it's usually not, hey, I think I'll go face my shadow. I think I'll make appointments with Tate. It's like, something's happened. Something that's been working no longer is. Some health issue, some psychological crisis. It's not a choice we make to deliberately go, I got it, I'm going to face my shadow.
No.
No.
Some big trouble.
Mm-hmm. Which is a gift.
Mm-hmm.
Because it shatters, or doesn't necessarily have to shatter, but it cracks the facade, that whole persona idea. And you have to go down. When you face your shadow, you have to go down. And in the literature, that's called the catabasis, the descent.
It's not up.
It's not up.
No. It's another gift, really, when we come to work with you, or we come ready to face our shadow, and it's got to go down. That's like right in with saying I don't have a shadow, or how could I have a shadow?
Mm-hmm.
I'm also going to say, how can I go down when I want to go up?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the adventure of this life will give us opportunities to face our shadow. And I think the opportunities can be so intimidating that they're avoided. And I think that's normal. And when it has gripped us to the point that it's disturbing, nightmares are happening, dysfunction in relationship and friendship is going on, denying all of the above is running out of gas. Yeah, that beautiful encounter with the self.
The next piece, you had 3 tasks assigned to that living with our shadow. Find it was first.
Mm-hmm.
Contain it was second. And then integrate it. How do we integrate this understanding of the shadow, or how do we integrate my personal version, my personal shadow?
Mm-hmm.
How do I integrate that?
Yeah. Well, I think the task of integration holds true for whatever material it is we're talking about. That's kind of like the mature, now we've reached a kind of maturity in the conversation. And we are going to look at how do we integrate that. And so that means a certain level of honesty. It means a certain level of vulnerability, and it means a certain kind of intentionality to not only see and own and contain the shadow, but now to integrate it. Again, the image that comes to me is, inviting somebody in from the cold into the hearth, into the warmth. It's like, okay, you've been denied, you've been excluded. Now the task is to integrate it. And that again means another level of conversation. And typically that's when the dreams start to change, when you start to take responsibility in this integration way. The dreams will no longer have that dark force chasing you. There'll be some sort of lunch, some sort of togetherness, some sort with the characters in the dream, some sort of cooperative effort now.
The integration piece. When you get there, it makes all that work worthwhile.
It does.
Suddenly, I do have a shadow. I'm familiar with what it looks like when it's expressed or when it's in charge. And now I'm integrating it.
Yeah. That would be the Cliff Notes,
Yes.
That would be a synopsis of it. And that integration has to go along with the comprehensive task of facing your shame. They're really synonymous, shame and shadow. Without facing and the specifics of your own shadow or the specifics of your own shame, which are interactive. And when we think about integrating it, you have to face your way of compensating for feeling inadequate, because that's what the shame shadow is all about. Yeah, they are so inextricably bound together in the netherlands of our psyche, in the dark recesses of our hidden storyline, which is, again, 90% of who we are. We're just coasting on thin ice when we go through the days, which is not to say that that's a pessimistic, although it sure sounds like it, or fatalistic. Don't mean that. Maybe even cynical. No. It's just once you start to break through the surface and go through the different steps we're talking about today and end up facing your shadow, which means you'll have to deconstruct your own shame story. You can't do one without the other. Then that's when people leave the practice, typically. When this table is set, it takes strength and a certain kind of courage and a certain kind of trust in the therapist, guiding us into that darkness, into those places that we want to avoid.
The word boon comes to mind. I'm curious, what do I get from doing this shadow work?
Well, let's say you're overweight. And let's say you track your weight by getting on the scale daily. And let's say you're really self-conscious about that overweightness, that obesity. And you take steps to face that. And here we are a week later, and it's a number that's 10 pounds less than it was. So that's the boon in weight loss, but it's also analogous to the boon of facing your shadow. There's a certain density and heaviness and weight that you didn't know you were carrying that now is starting to lift. Without mixing the metaphors too much, it might be like walking in the fog, bumping into shit, and then the sun comes through and shows a path. There's a lightness of being. One of my most cherished phrases, the unbearable lightness of being. There's a lightness. And as one would think, that should be the boon, and it is. But we get so accustomed and acclimated to our heaviness and darkness, it has its own gravitational pull. It draws us back. Whether we be talking about moods or depression, it's just really familiar and feels comfortable in its own strange, ironic way.
I like that weight loss metaphor because it's as if the weight comes back on. It's comfortable. It's easy. And the weight, you kind of go in the other direction. And that unbearable lightness that you're speaking about is a very difficult path. It's not
ironic. Our children are in the grace of their light. They'll have tantrums and they'll run into things and have trouble, but it's not a lifestyle. It's an event. It hasn't become a burden. And that's part of what the loss of innocence and the whole, I guess I'll say, tragedy of maturing is that you realize you have to face what we're talking about in some way or another, not necessarily like we're talking about it. Maybe people will access what we're talking about and have a better roadmap for the experience they're having. That's kind of our intention here. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that unbearable lightness of being, it's not lightness of being, it's the unbearable lightness of being, really hits at the center of this paradox of the challenge of lightening up by facing your shadow and deconstructing your shame, the load that comes off. And one of the phrases I do hear, now that I'm thinking about it, when people leave the door or leave my office and walk through the threshold, saying, I feel lighter.
I've personally felt that feeling, maybe 100 times or a lot of times. And then I met people in my life who also studied with you, practiced with you, and faced their shadow, learned about their shame story. And words that I often heard was, I float down the sidewalk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I've heard that phrase as well.
Mm-hmm. Leaving your blue door, I float down the sidewalk.
Yeah. Damn, that's rewarding.
It's so rewarding.
Yeah.
For you and us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And unbearable, really, because what a reward and what a feeling. But it seems short. Or, suddenly you get a call and you're in debt. Or suddenly someone's angry or something churns up and starts that weight.
That's right. Yeah. Lucky if you make it a block.
Right. Lucky if you make it a block.
Without something happening.
Let's circle back for just a moment to the time that you spoke about when someone leaves. Yes. Usually they turn away from. What's that look like?
Turn away from what we were
talking about? Yeah, turn away
from
their own personal understanding of their shadow.
Well, it's a somewhat comical moment, actually, because I've locked the door. And so the energy of departure is accelerating. Basically, get me out of here. Nice work, thanks. Paid you. I got to go. And then the door's locked. And they pull on the handle, typically, and it's like, wait a minute, let me help you here. Turn the lock, and it's a substantial lock. So click. And now the door opens. I open the door for them. And without being overly dramatic, there is a bit of a bolt.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like, whoo. And another touching moment is the individual will turn and face me. You know, they're not running down Main Street with their hair on fire. You know, they'll stop because they're now out of the container in the flow or mayhem of Main Street. And I really relish that turning around and looking at me and we looking at each other. And, you know, I'll say something silly like, go get 'em.
Mm-hmm.
Well done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
See you on the street.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
When you moved into that space in the 80s, was the shadow work part of the original story?
Good question. I was fully at the mercy of my own shadow, which is a very hard story.
Mm-hmm.
I was rocking my shadow, acting it out, projecting it. Did you hear? I was the man. And yeah, it was rough. For the first probably 10 years. Wow. Until I matured and had to face my shadow, which involved getting on a jet plane and going to Boston, and had the access to one of the foremost psychiatrists in the country who worked at McLean Hospital in Boston, a renowned institution. And we had 4 sessions in 2 days together. That was me facing my shadow. Round 1.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Courage.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Fueled by desperation.
Mm-hmm. Like
yeah. The whole crack happened, you know. When that crack happens is when we talked earlier about typically when people come through the door, when there's a crack in the idea of oneself. And yeah, that was tough. And without that, I wouldn't be half the therapist I am. I had to face my shadow. Mm-hmm. Guess what?
Just like we do.
Yep. Never go to a therapist who hasn't done their own intense work. And I'm not talking about kind of just getting a master's or group work. I'm talking about facing themselves in intensive therapy.
And if you are working with a therapist who has not faced their shadow, they're not going to be able to teach you how to do that.
Right. Yep. You'll stay in the new age, which is a form of psychosis.
And very light and up. Easy.
Avoidant, but easy.
Avoiding, yeah.
Yeah, because it has all the right chops to it, all the right words, all the right phrases, you know, powerful stuff we have access to. It can be marketed in 1,000 different ways, but no depth.
No depth, yeah. There's not a lot of people marketing the descent.
Right. Let's put it down there.
Okay. We've reached the end of another session in the Blue Door Playbook, a podcast for the soul, featuring archetypal psychotherapist Timothy Tate. Thanks for listening. I'm Putter Brown. Stay tuned for the next episode, where Timothy discusses shame. The content in this podcast is strictly for informational and entertainment purposes only. If you are experiencing mental health symptoms, please contact a mental health provider in your community.